Hello there, and welcome to the lecture for Biology 101, Session 1. Today, we will be discussing basically your introductory chapter. And what that entails is talking a little bit about science in general, because biology is a science, and then about some specific aspects of biology and the way your course will run this semester. Today's will be a little bit shorter, probably won't use the whiteboard as much because everything's pretty basic, but this should give you a good appreciation for science, biology, and how these will go for the rest of the semester. So why don't we dive right in and ask, how does science impact the everyday world? Well, it's pretty obvious that science plays a really important part in our lives. Look on websites, check the news. They're always going to be talking about some new scientific discovery and what impact it will have on your life, good or bad. Science is becoming more and more important in our daily lives. Yet the average American has, at best, an uneven knowledge of science. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, everybody has different backgrounds and experiences with science based on the education that they've had. And that's really why you're taking this class, is because we want to smooth out some of that unevenness when we give you your education here to try and fill in some of those gaps, to make things make more sense, to give you a general understanding of science and the process of science. For many of you, you could have chosen many electives to take for your science credit, and that's why we'll have emphasis on science and the process of science throughout the semester. We will also talk, though, a lot about biology, because this is a Biology 101 class, and so we're going to be talking about the study of life immensely, always keeping in mind that it is a science. So what is science? Science is both a body of knowledge, a collection of unified insights about nature, and the evidence for this is an array of facts. And so the unified insights of science are known as a theory, and a theory is a general set of principles supported by evidence that explains some aspect of nature. However, science can also be defined as a way of learning, a process of coming to an understanding of the natural world through observation and testing hypotheses. So what we really have are these two things here. When we talk about science, it could be all those things that we know. For instance, a dog has X number of puppies on average, or plants grow better with sunlight than without sunlight. And there are all these things that we know. But yet, there's so much that we don't know. There are so many things about the natural world that we just simply have no answers to. And the nice thing about science and about biology is that we can discover those answers through using science as a process. And so science as a process uses the scientific method, which follows these basic steps. You start with an observation and question about the world. That leads to a hypothesis, which leads to an experiment, which leads to a conclusion, and we go back to the top again. This is known as the scientific method. And in the scientific method, whatever you're testing will not be proven true. You'll lend support to your hypothesis. And we're not going to take that much time on the scientific method here because in the laboratory portion of the course, you'll get a little bit more in-depth analysis of that. Or sorry, I shouldn't say analysis, a little bit in-depth exposure to that. So we'll kind of gloss over it here. But a hypothesis is what you're testing, and it will typically have a because in the statement at this level, where basically we'll say, I think the world is this way because of this. And so your book provides you this example of Louis Pasteur's experiment regarding the spontaneous generation of life. And so it gives you this figure, but let's talk about this a little bit and work through it. So people around the time of Louis Pasteur, they observed that, well, life exists. And they said, well, where does life come from? And that was a question. And a lot of people said, well, life generates spontaneously. And here's why they thought that. If you took a piece of steak and you put it out on a table and you leave it there, what's going to happen? First couple days, not very much. But if you give it long enough, eventually maggots will appear in that steak. And so people looked at that and they said, look at this. Maggots spontaneously generate inside this steak, and therefore life can spontaneously generate. That's where life comes from. It comes out of nowhere. It's like magic. Well, Pasteur looked at this and he thought, well, gee, I don't really think that's what's going on. And his experiment was with bacteria and broth. We're using steaks as an example because it's a little bit easier to follow. And he said, I don't think life spontaneously generates. I think that somehow life is getting there onto that steak, and therefore that's where the life is coming from. So his hypothesis was life does not spontaneously generate. And so in order to test this, he made a prediction and designed an experiment. In his experiment, what he did was he said, I think that if I shield this steak from life, from living organisms, by putting a cover on it, that we will not see maggots grow there. Because I think maggots have to come from someplace else. And in this case, he was thinking flies. And so he said, then we're going to set up these other 10 steaks. And with those other 10 steaks, what we'll do is we'll leave them open to the environment so flies can land there. And so his experiment was 10 steaks with covers, 10 steaks without covers, and he was going to compare if maggots generated in these two scenarios. So his prediction was that maggots will not form in covered steaks. And when he did his experiment, that's what he found. His conclusion was, wow, look at this. Maggots didn't form in covered steaks. Therefore, we go back up to our hypothesis, life does not spontaneously generate. Now, had he proven that? No. He hadn't definitively said life could never spontaneously generate. He had one example from one experiment. But what it did do is lend support to his hypothesis. He could now say, I have some evidence here that life doesn't spontaneously generate, and we need to consider the idea that maybe life comes from other life in all instances. Again, that was one brief example. You'll cover a bit more in your laboratory. And so everything we have in science is subject to challenge or revision. And that's an important point of the end of this the end of the scientific method here, is that this conclusion doesn't mean that we're over. Really, on this figure, these conclusions are always subject to question and further testing, and there should really be another line that goes right back up here. This process never ends. It's not as though one day scientists will wake up and say, oh, we figured everything out. We can all quit our jobs and go home. Everything's solved, nothing to worry about. The fact is that science will always lead to new questions, new hypotheses, and new ideas. Let's get back to where we were there. Scientific claims must be falsifiable, meaning open to negation through scientific inquiry. And in science, we can only investigate natural phenomena for which we can collect data and make observations. Therefore, we do not test aspects of the supernatural with science. You may have seen shows about people doing that and stuff, but that's really not science in those cases. So we talked a little bit about science in general, and let's talk about the nature of biology and a little bit about the history of biology. Biology means the study of life. Bio means life, ology, study of, biology, study of life. Life is defined by a group of 8 characteristics possessed by living things. And let's work through each of these things, and we'll use you as an example of a living thing that does this. All right, do you assimilate energy? What do we mean by that? Do you take in energy and use energy from the outside world? Simple answer is yes. How do you do that? I'm guessing you all eat. That's all that fancy term means, is organisms assimilate energy, and in this case for us it's eating. For plants it's photosynthesis. So organisms can do this in different ways, but every organism must assimilate energy. Living things respond to their environment. Do you respond to your environment? Well, I can tell you right now, if you're watching this, you're seeing this, you're getting visual signals, and you're thinking. And in regard to that thinking, at some point you'll take some action, maybe moving on to do the next portion of the class or whatever. Responding to the environment does not have to be complex. It does not have to be an animal response. So for instance, if we think about plants, plants respond to the environment. Have you ever seen a plant grow toward a light source? That's that plant responding to a signal from the environment. And this is important Because what would happen to you if you could not respond to the environment in any way? Well, in that case, you'd just be a lump that did nothing, and you couldn't do any of the other things that we're seeing are required for life. And so life requires that response. You have to maintain a relatively stable internal environment. What do we mean by that? Well, there are certain conditions that you need to maintain in order to stay alive. And so, for instance, let's get that whole title in there. And so, for instance, you have skin. That skin helps keep moisture inside your body. It's critical to you staying alive that you don't dry out. And also, think about your temperature. If your temperature goes too high, you're going to sweat to bring that down. If it goes too low, you'll shiver to bring it back up. And so, living things must maintain a relatively constant internal environment. And I should mention, this also goes for small organisms. Even cells that you'll learn about very soon must fulfill the same basic requirement. They have a cell membrane. There's the outside world. There's the inside world. They maintain balances of chemicals and molecules inside their bodies that's different than outside. Living things must reproduce. And this one should be pretty obvious. How many living things would there be if none of them reproduced? The answer is 0. For humans as a species to survive, they must reproduce. And likewise, any other species must reproduce to survive. And so the only reason we have life is because organisms reproduce. Possess inherited information base encoded in DNA that allows them to function. And so, in this case, all living things, with the possible exception of viruses, the jury's kind of out on if viruses are alive or not. I personally am in the camp of viruses are alive, but there's some other scientists who don't agree. But all living things, with the exception of viruses, possess an inherited information base encoded in DNA. And the reason why viruses are different is because there's some RNA viruses that use RNA instead of DNA. But for the most part, every organism that you see alive in the world has information encoded in DNA. If something did not have DNA, it would not have the basic building blocks required to code for that information that makes life. DNA, you'll learn in the semester, is like instructions that inform how to build an organism. And those instructions further help that organism to function while it's alive. Without those instructions, you can't have a living thing. Are composed of one or more cells. This is another one that viruses don't meet, but living things, we say the smallest living unit is a cell. It's because if you look around the world, every living thing we see, again with the exception of viruses, is a cell. Evolve from other living things. This has to go along with reproduction. And during this semester, you'll find out how critical and important evolution is to the study of biology. It's evolution that led to the diversity of life that we have today, and all living things are evolved from other living things. And what this basically says is that there's kind of one common ancestor for life and a branching tree of all living organisms that have evolved from that. And so, for instance, we start off with one common ancestor, and we branch off again and again and again with descent with modification, and we ultimately get to all the diversity of life forms that we see today. And so any living thing you can point to is evolved from another living thing. Lastly, are highly organized compared to inanimate objects. This is true. If you take a rock, it may look fancy, like say a crystal, but it's not nearly as complex and organized as even the most primitive living organism. And this is because living organisms take the unorganized world and they organize it in very complex ways so that they can live. I shouldn't say so they can live. And thus, that's a characteristic of life. We do not see living organisms that do not have some basic level of complexity that's beyond inanimate objects that we find in the world. Life is hierarchical. What do we mean by this? Life can be, so those were the requirements for life. We're moving on now to life is hierarchical. Life is organized in a hierarchical manner, ranging from increasing complexity from small things to larger things. And let's take a look at this image here. It's going to be tough for you to see, but perhaps you can go ahead and look for it in your book. Let's zoom in as much as I can there. In this case, what we're saying here is that if we want to look at where life is, to get to life, we've got to start out with atoms. Those atoms make molecules. Those molecules make something known as organelles. Organelles, you'll find out in the next couple in the next couple sessions, are basically like the organs of cells. Pardon me, are like the organs of cells. These cells make up tissues. Tissues make up organs. Those organisms make up those organs make up organ systems, which make up entire organisms. If you take a bunch of organisms and put them together, you get populations. If you take multiple populations, you get communities. And when you consider communities at a very large scale, you've got ecosystems. That's the abiotic and biotic factors interacting, and then we have all of those on the Earth. And if you take a moment to look at your syllabus, something you'll see is that life exists, that your syllabus has a hierarchy structure to it. You're going to start off the semester at this small level. Your first 4 sections cover biology at the small scale. You then take a break and look at some conceptual things in biology, things that you couldn't hold. And then you move on to the diversity of life section, which covers the different organisms that you find in each of these groups. And we also look at some organs and tissues of animals specifically in there. And then the last block of your class covers large-scale things in biology, such as communities and ecosystems. And so what we see in this class is a start with things that are very small, moving all the way up to larger and larger scales or in this hierarchy. So what makes biology special? Well, I'd like to think there's lots of things that make biology special. It's a subject that I very much enjoy. But there are some things that are relatively unique to biology. Let's start with a little bit of history of biology. Early on, biology was just a descriptive science that cataloged and described the Earth's living things. Up until the early 19th century, people were just going around, for the most part, and trying to find living things that they could then catalog and say, this is a bear, this is a lion, this is a pine tree, this is a different kind of tree. And they organized all those into a big list that was that catalog. But if those were questions about just what is out there. But eventually biologists started asking questions that said, well, how does the world work? And that's where biology went into an experimental type of science. But it's important to note that biology is much more complex than some of these other fields. And so, for instance, let's compare biology for a second to chemistry. Let's say I walked in here and I had 2 beakers, beaker A and beaker B. And then there's a third beaker in the middle, and I pour the 2 chemicals together, and there's a reaction. And then I come back in the next day, chemical A, chemical B, same system, same amounts, pour them together, reaction. If I come back a third time, a fourth time, it's going to have the same reaction every day. However, now let's take an example of a biological system. Let's say that I brought in 2 of those, have you ever seen in fancy movies where they lift off the lids of food that's supposed to be really fancy? 2 of those lids. And on this lid, under this one is a cat. And under this one is a mouse. What is going to happen when I lift that lid off of these at the same time? Now, a lot of you might say, well, the cat's going to chase the mouse. And that may be true. Let's say I come back the next time, lift it up. Is the exact same thing going to happen again? Maybe that cat's not hungry. Maybe the mouse, instead of running that way, runs that way right into the cat's mouth. There are so many nuances inside that biological system that it ends up being more complex. And so biology is noted for its complexity compared to other aspects of the natural world. Biology does not deal in universal rules for this reason, and biological research may focus on a particular process or portions of the living world. The big reason for this is is that because there is such complexity, it makes it tough to make things that we'll actually call laws. In biology, theories are big, important things that have lots of support. And we wrap up talking about evolution. I already mentioned today how all the forms of life that you see today are a function of evolution. And so evolution gradually gave us all the life that we see. And what you're going to find out is that how things do the things they do and why they are the way they are both a result of evolution. And so to understand life as a whole, evolution ties everything together. And we'll hit on this concept more and more again throughout the semester. So that is a brief lecture of some points from session 1. And what we'll do is next week we're going to move on to chemistry. And because remember that hierarchy, we're going to start with these very little things and show you how they build the bigger things through these first few sections here. You may have said, well, gee, why am I studying chemistry? I came here to take biology. Well, the simple fact is ultimately you're made of chemicals. And so understanding those chemicals at the basic level are going to be important to your understanding biology. And so I will hopefully see you here again next week. Bye-bye.